Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're diving back into the forgotten corners of history to uncover moments that quietly shaped our world. Whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time with me. Those romantic castle scenes with flowing gowns and chivalrous knights, the reality was far more complicated. We're talking about an era where a bath was a true luxury. Privacy was practically non-existent. According to church doctrine, sex served exactly one purpose: making babies. Anything beyond that basic biological function was considered somewhere between sinful and downright demonic. There were traditional festivals and celebrations where young people could meet and court each other with a bit more freedom than usual. The church officially forbade any attempt to prevent conception, considering an interference with God's will. Medieval records are full of scandals involving monks and nuns who broke their vows, often with consequences that ranged from public penance to expulsion from religious orders. Women were simultaneously seen as dangerously lustful temptresses who could lead men to sin, and as naturally pure beings who needed protection from male desires. Girls were considered ready for marriage once they reached puberty, which often meant marriages and sexual relationships beginning at ages that would be considered shocking by modern standards. Boys typically married slightly later but still in their teens. From the passionate poetry of courtly love to the body humor of popular ballads, these works reveal a complex understanding of human relationships that goes far beyond the simple stereotypes that we often have about medieval attitudes towards sex. The role of midwives and wise women in medieval communities was crucial but precarious. These women, the concept of childhood as a protected period of development was largely unknown, and young people were expected to assume adult responsibilities, including sexual ones, much earlier than we would consider appropriate today. Privacy, something we take for granted in our romantic lives, was virtually non-existent for most medieval people. Peasant families lived in one- or two-room houses, often sharing space with their animals. Even noble families lived in close quarters with servants and other household members. Wedding nights and marital intimacy happened with the knowledge that others were likely within earshot, if not in the same room. This lack of privacy meant that sexual relationships were often community knowledge, whether people wanted them to be or not. This contradiction led to some fascinating tensions in how medieval society approached relationships between men and women. Divorce was nearly impossible for most people, requiring either an annulment based on very specific grounds or entering religious life. This meant that people often found themselves trapped in unhappy or abusive marriages with no legal recourse. Same-sex relationships existed in medieval times, though they were heavily condemned by both church and secular authorities. The penalties for homosexual behavior could be severe, including death in some jurisdictions. However, historical records suggest that such relationships did occur, often hidden within the accepted frameworks of close friendship or religious devotion. Medical knowledge about sexuality was limited and often completely wrong. Medieval physicians believed in the theory of humors, the idea that health depended on balancing for bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sexual behavior was thought to affect this balance, with too much or too little sexual activity potentially causing serious illness. Some medical texts recommended regular sexual activity for health, while others warned that excessive passion could literally drive people insane. The Church's idealization of celibacy created enormous tension between spiritual aspirations and biological reality. Prostitution was widespread throughout medieval Europe, though it operated in a complex legal and moral gray area. Many cities actually licensed brothels and regulated prostitution as a way to control what they saw as inevitable male sexual behavior, while protecting respectable women from unwanted advances. Prostitutes occupied a unique position in medieval society, simultaneously essential and despised, tolerated and persecuted. But that didn't stop people from trying various methods, from herbal remedies to primitive barrier methods made from animal intestines. The effectiveness of these approaches was, to put it charitably, inconsistent. Women bore the primary responsibility for managing fertility, often relying on knowledge passed down through generations of mothers and midwives. Some medieval texts suggest that women used everything from honey and vinegar douches to amulets and prayers in attempts to prevent unwanted pregnancies. The tragic reality was that many women spent their entire adult lives in cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, with maternal mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and other seasonal gatherings provided opportunities for flirtation, dancing, the kind of romantic connections that might lead to marriage, assuming, of course, that the parents approved and the economic arrangements worked out. The reality of medieval sexual education was basically non-existent. Young people learned about intimacy through a combination of overheard conversations, observation of farm animals, and whatever garbled information they could glean from older relatives. The church's official position was that too much knowledge about sex would lead to sin. So they kept information deliberately vague and focused primarily on the spiritual dangers of physical pleasure. This led to some truly bizarre medieval beliefs about reproduction and sexuality. Many people believed that conception required both partners to reach climax simultaneously, which inadvertently led to more attention being paid to female pleasure than you might expect. Others thought that a woman's diet during pregnancy would determine the baby's personality, or that certain positions could influence whether the child would be male or female. The church actually provided detailed guidance on when married couples could and couldn't be intimate, creating what was essentially a medieval sexual calendar that would make modern relationship counselors weep. First, there were the obvious no-go times. Sundays, because that was God's day. Wednesdays and Fridays, because those were fasting days. The entire 40 days of Lent, because suffering was supposed to be spiritual. Then there were the feast days, and there were a lot of them. Add in the periods when women were considered unclean during menstruation and after childbirth, and you were left with maybe 100 days a year, when the church grudgingly admitted that married couples could be intimate without risking eternal damnation, and your love life was pretty much decided by committee. The church could regulate marriage, but it couldn't regulate human nature. Love affairs were common, though incredibly risky. Getting caught in adultery could result in public humiliation, severe punishment, or even death, depending on your social status and how forgiving your spouse felt. The concept of courtly love emerged among the nobility as a way to channel romantic feelings that couldn't be expressed within marriage. Knights would declare passionate, usually unconsummated love for noble ladies, writing poetry and performing grand gestures while maintaining a supposedly chaste relationship. It was like medieval fan fiction, except the consequences for crossing the line were decidedly more permanent. But here's the thing. Medieval people were still human beings, with all the same desires, frustrations, awkward moments we have today, just with a lot more dirt and significantly fewer options for birth control. So settle in as we explore what it was really like to navigate love, lust, and everything in between, when your life expectancy was about as long as a modern Netflix series and your relationship status was likely determined before you could walk. Before we jump into the surprisingly scandalous world of medieval bedroom antics, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Seriously, when most people today complain about their dating app matches being shallow, at least they're not being literally traded for a few cows and some fertile farmland. In medieval times, marriage was essentially a business transaction. Romance was about as relevant as your credit score is to your shoe size. For the vast majority of medieval people, the peasants who made up roughly 90% of the population, marriage was a practical arrangement designed to ensure survival. Picture this. You re a 14-year-old girl whose father has just negotiated your marriage to the blacksmith's son in exchange for some grain and a promise to help with the harvest. Your wedding night isn't preceded by months of courtship and romantic dinners. It's preceded by a brief ceremony where you re-hand it over like a particularly valuable piece of property. Drop a comment below, whether you're tucked into bed in Manchester or just waking up in Melbourne. I'm thrilled you're here for this journey back to a time when things got spicy, in ways you definitely did in Learn About in history class. Now, if Hollywood has taught us anything about medieval times, it's probably wrong. Let's start with the brutal truth about medieval marriage. It wasn't about love, it was about livestock. The medieval church had very specific ideas about sex, and spoiler alert, they weren't particularly enthusiastic about it. But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all these restrictions, medieval people found ways to be remarkably creative about their romantic lives. For peasants, romantic expression was far more straightforward and practical. Medieval contraception was a mixture of folk wisdom, religious prohibition, and desperate improvisation. For those rare individuals who chose religious life, celibacy was supposed to be absolute. But even monasteries and convents struggled with human nature. The medieval understanding of female sexuality was particularly contradictory. The age of consent, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist in medieval times. The Church's influence on medieval sexuality extended beyond just moral guidance. It actively shaped laws and social customs around marriage, divorce, and sexual behavior. Medieval literature provides some of our best insights into how people of the time thought about love and sexuality. From the passionate poetry of courtly love to the bawdy humor of popular ballads, these works reveal a complex understanding of human relationships that goes far beyond the simple stereotypes we often have about medieval attitudes towards sex. The role of midwives and wise women in medieval communities was crucial, but precarious. Birth records from medieval communities show clear patterns related to agricultural cycles, with more babies born in late winter and early spring, suggesting that conception often occurred during the more leisurely periods after harvest. Romance, when it occurred, was often a luxury that few could afford to prioritize over the basic necessities of life. Behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of priests and moral authorities, people found ways to navigate their desires and intimate relationships that often diverged significantly from prescribed behavior. Physicians believed that sexual pleasure was not only natural but necessary for conception, leading to the curious notion that both partners needed to achieve climax for pregnancy to occur. These elaborate rituals of devotion, often conducted outside the bounds of marriage, celebrated passionate longing and emotional connection in ways that directly contradicted church teachings about the sinfulness of desire. While official teaching condemned any sexual activity outside of procreative marriage, confession manuals and penitential texts reveal a wide range of behaviors that were common enough to require specific guidance for priests. These texts discuss everything from premarital relations and adultery to various forms of sexual expression within marriage that went beyond simple procreation. These women possessed practical understanding of contraception, abortion, fertility enhancement, and sexual health that was passed down through generations of female practitioners. A woman's sexual reputation could determine her marriage prospects and social standing. But this same system also created opportunities for women to exercise agency through their sexual choices. Some women used their sexuality strategically to improve their circumstances, while others found ways to resist unwanted sexual advances or marriages. Medieval sexual culture also included recognition of diverse sexual orientations and gender expressions. Though these were understood very differently than in modern times, while same-sex relationships were officially condemned, they clearly existed and sometimes flourished. Particularly in environments like monasteries, courts, and urban centers, where people of the same gender lived and worked closely together. Their knowledge often conflicted with official church teaching, but served real community needs. Sexual violence and exploitation were unfortunate realities of medieval life, particularly for women of lower social status. However, legal systems did provide some protections, and communities often rallied to support victims of sexual assault. The concept of consent, while different from modern understanding, was recognized in medieval law. And rape was considered a serious crime, though prosecution and punishment were often inadequate. The medieval approach to sexuality was also deeply influenced by seasonal and social rhythms. Certain times of the year were considered more appropriate for sexual activity. With spring and early summer being favored for weddings and conception, religious calendars created extended periods of sexual abstinence, but these were often observed more in theory than in practice, particularly among the working classes who could not afford to limit their reproductive efforts to church-approved periods. Knights would pledge themselves to married ladies, engaging in elaborate courtships that were understood to be spiritual and ennobling. Even when they clearly contained erotic elements, couples found ways to create intimate spaces within the constraints of communal living arrangements. Bed curtains, private chambers for the wealthy, and the natural rhythms of rural life provided opportunities for sexual expression away from community oversight. The darkness of medieval nights, broken only by expensive candles or firelight, created natural boundaries around intimate activities. Medieval attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth reveal complex understandings of sexuality and reproduction. While large families were generally desired for economic and social reasons, People also understood the risks of frequent pregnancy and developed various strategies for spacing children. Prolonged breastfeeding, which naturally suppressed ovulation, is one commonly used method, though its contraceptive effects were understood empirically rather than scientifically. The reality of medieval marriages varied enormously depending on social class, region, and individual circumstances. While many unions were indeed arranged for economic or political reasons, evidence from letters, court records, and literary sources suggests that affection and even passionate love were not uncommon. Couples developed genuine emotional bonds, shared intimate jokes and private languages, and mourned deeply when separated by death or circumstance. This belief, derived from ancient Greek medical texts, meant that women's sexual satisfaction was considered medically important, even if it was morally suspect. The concept of female sexuality itself was deeply contradictory in medieval thought. Women were simultaneously viewed as lustful temptresses whose desires could lead men astray, and as passive vessels whose primary purpose was reproduction. Medical texts described women as having stronger sexual appetites than men, requiring careful management and control. Yet the same culture that feared female sexuality also recognized its power, creating a tension that permeated medieval attitudes toward intimate relationships. The Church's teachings on sexuality, while influential, were not uniformly enforced or universally followed. Rural communities, in particular, often maintained older customs and practices that predated Christian influence. Hand-fasting ceremonies, where couples would live together for a year and a day before formal marriage, remained common in many regions, despite ecclesiastical disapproval. These trial marriages allowed couples to test their compatibility and fertility before making permanent vows, a practical arrangement that served community needs even as it challenged church authority. Yet within these constraints, people found ways to express affection, desire, and even genuine love. The medieval period laid the groundwork for many of our modern ideas about sexuality, relationships, and marriage, even as it established patterns and attitudes that would take centuries to change. Understanding medieval sexuality isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity. It's about recognizing how deeply our current attitudes and assumptions about sex and relationships are rooted in centuries of cultural development. As we've seen, sex in medieval times was far from the simple, repressed picture that popular culture often paints. It was complex, contradictory, and deeply human. Medieval people faced many of the same fundamental questions about love, desire, and relationships that we grapple with today. It's just within a very different framework of possibilities and constraints. The medieval approach to sexuality was shaped by a unique combination of religious doctrine, practical necessity, limited medical knowledge, and very human desires that transcended all attempts at control and regulation. While we might be grateful for modern advances in medicine, law, and social attitudes that give us more choices and better protection, the basic human experiences of love, lust, disappointment, and joy remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. This wasn't necessarily planned. It likely reflected the natural rhythms of a society where survival depended on agricultural success. The medieval understanding of male and female roles in sexuality was heavily influenced by classical Greek and Roman medical texts, which often contained ideas that seem bizarre by modern standards. For example, many medieval physicians believed that women needed to reach orgasm in order to conceive, leading to medical advice that was surprisingly focused on female pleasure, albeit for completely different reasons than modern sexual education. These women possessed knowledge about fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and women's health that was essential for their communities. But their expertise also made them targets of suspicion. Many of the women accused of witchcraft during the later medieval period were midwives or healers, whose knowledge of herbs and women's bodies was seen as potentially dangerous. Seasonal patterns played a major role in medieval sexual behavior and reproduction. Medieval wedding customs varied enormously across different regions and social classes, but many included elements designed to ensure fertility and sexual success. Some ceremonies included blessings of the marriage bed, public celebrations of the couple's first night together, or rituals intended to promote conception. These customs reflected the community's investment in the couple's reproductive success. The concept of romantic love, as we understand it today, began to emerge during the medieval period, particularly in the literature and culture of courtly love. However, this idealized form of love was often explicitly non-sexual, creating a tension between spiritual devotion and physical desire that would influence European culture for centuries. For the vast majority of medieval people, sexual relationships were shaped by practical concerns: survival, economic stability, and social expectations. Despite the Church's stern proclamations and society's rigid expectations, the reality of medieval sexual life was far more complex and contradictory than official doctrine would suggest. Medieval people possessed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of human sexuality. Though it was filtered through the lens of humoral theory and classical medical texts, courtly love traditions, which flourished among the nobility, created an entirely different framework for understanding desire and romance. Sexual practices themselves were more varied than church doctrine would suggest. Privacy, while scarce, was not entirely absent from medieval life. The role of midwives and female healers in sexual and reproductive health created networks of knowledge that operated largely outside official medical and religious structures. The intersection of sexuality with concepts of honor and reputation created complex social dynamics. A woman's sexual reputation could determine her marriage prospects and social standing. But this same system also created opportunities for women to exercise agency through their sexual choices. Some women used their sexuality strategically to improve their circumstances, while others found ways to resist unwanted sexual advances or marriages. Medieval sexual culture also included recognition of diverse sexual orientations and gender expressions, though these were understood very differently than in modern times. Official teachings declared that sex was permissible only within marriage and solely for procreation. Yet, medieval theologians engaged in surprisingly detailed discussions about sexual pleasure. Harvest festivals, May Day celebrations, and other communal gatherings provided opportunities for young people to meet, court, and form romantic attachments. Physicians believed in the four humors and thought that sexual activity was essential for maintaining physical and mental health. Medieval people employed various methods to prevent pregnancy, from herbal remedies and barrier methods to timing intercourse around perceived fertile periods. However, medieval law codes did recognize rape as a serious crime, though the penalties and likelihood of prosecution varied greatly depending on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. Women who were raped could seek justice through both secular and church courts, though the burden of proof was often difficult to meet, and social stigma could be devastating. Same-sex relationships existed throughout medieval society, though they were officially condemned by both church and secular authorities. Despite legal prohibitions, evidence suggests that romantic and sexual relationships between people of the same gender occurred across all social levels. These relationships often operated within existing social structures, such as monastic communities, noble households, or craft guilds, where close same-sex friendships provided cover for more intimate connections. While the Church condemned such practices, the reality of economic hardship and the dangers of childbirth made family planning a practical necessity for many couples. Folk knowledge included pessaries made from honey and other substances, herbal drinks that supposedly prevented conception, and careful observation of natural fertility signs. Prostitution existed throughout medieval society, often operating within a complex legal and social framework. Many towns had official red light districts where prostitution was regulated rather than banned outright. These areas were often located near city walls or in specific neighborhoods, with rules governing everything from pricing to health inspections. Some prostitutes worked independently, while others operated within organized brothels. The Church's attitude was typically one of reluctant tolerance, viewing prostitution as a necessary evil that prevented worse sins like adultery or rape. They prescribed different frequencies of intercourse based on age, temperament, and season. Hot, moist temperaments required more frequent sexual activity to maintain balance, while cold, dry constitutions needed less. This medical approach meant that sexuality was viewed not just as a moral issue, but as a matter of physical well-being. Women's sexuality occupied a particularly complex position in medieval thought. While officially subordinated to men, women were also recognized as having their own sexual needs and desires. Medical texts acknowledged that women could experience intense pleasure, and even discussed the female equivalent of male climax. Midwives and female healers possessed extensive knowledge about contraception, fertility, and sexual health, passing this information through networks of women despite official church disapproval. These events often included dancing, singing, and ritualized games that allowed for physical contact and flirtation within socially acceptable bounds. The tradition of bundling, where courting couples could spend the night together fully clothed and often separated by a board, provided intimacy while maintaining technical propriety. Privacy was indeed scarce in medieval households, but this limitation sparked creativity and ingenuity. Couples learned to communicate through subtle gestures, coded language, and stolen moments. The practice of courtly love, while idealized in literature, reflected real desires for emotional and physical connection that transcended purely practical arrangements. Even married couples in crowded living situations developed their own methods of maintaining intimacy. 8. Whether through careful timing, quiet communication, or temporary retreats to private spaces like gardens, barns, or secluded outdoor locations. Many church scholars actually argued that both partners should experience satisfaction during intercourse. Believing that mutual pleasure was necessary for conception, this led to remarkably frank conversations about technique, timing, and the importance of foreplay in ensuring both physical and spiritual harmony between spouses. Marriage itself operated on multiple levels of meaning and practice. While noble unions were primarily political and economic arrangements, even these strategic partnerships could blossom into genuine affection over time. Among common folk, marriages often began with practical considerations, but were frequently based on mutual attraction and compatibility. The church required consent from both parties, giving even peasant women a voice in their marital fate. Family pressure and economic necessity certainly influenced these decisions. While same-sex relationships were officially condemned, they clearly existed and sometimes flourished, particularly in environments like monasteries, courts, and urban centers where people of the same gender lived and worked closely together. The economic aspects of sexuality cannot be overlooked in understanding medieval intimate life. Sexual services were widely available through prostitution, which was often regulated rather than prohibited by medieval authorities. Bathhouses served as centers for both hygiene and sexual activity, while taverns and inns provided spaces where sexual commerce and casual encounters could occur. Musical traditions, folk customs, and seasonal celebrations often included sexually explicit content that provided outlets for expressing desires and knowledge that could not be openly discussed in other contexts. Harvest festivals, May Day celebrations, and wedding customs included rituals and songs that celebrated sexuality and fertility in ways that complemented and sometimes contradicted official religious teachings. The medieval understanding of sexual health included recognition that sexual activity had physical and emotional benefits beyond reproduction. Medical texts recommended sexual activity for maintaining health, treating various ailments, and ensuring emotional well-being. This medical perspective often provided justification for sexual practices that might otherwise be considered problematic by religious authorities. As medieval society evolved, particularly in urban centers and among merchant classes, new models of marriage and sexuality began to emerge. These included greater emphasis on companionate marriage, where emotional compatibility and mutual affection were valued alongside economic considerations. The rise of romantic literature and the increasing literacy of lay people contributed to new ways of thinking about love, desire, and intimate relationships. The legacy of medieval sexuality extends far beyond its own historical period. The tensions between desire and restraint, the complex negotiations between individual agency and social control, and the ongoing struggle to understand and regulate human sexuality established patterns that would influence Western culture for centuries to come. Looking at medieval sexuality through the lens of practical experience in human nature, we find a world far more complex and nuanced than church doctrine might suggest. While religious authorities preached strict moral codes and attempted to regulate intimate behavior, the reality of medieval life created countless opportunities for passion, love, and desire to flourish in unexpected ways. The church's influence on sexual practices was profound, yet often contradictory. The reality of medieval sexuality was shaped by the rhythm of agricultural life and seasonal celebrations. Medieval medical understanding of sexuality was a fascinating blend of classical knowledge, folk wisdom, and religious doctrine. The practice of contraception was more widespread than religious authorities like to admit. Sexual violence was unfortunately common, particularly affecting women of lower social status. However, medieval law codes did recognize rape as a serious crime, though the penalties and likelihood of prosecution varied greatly depending on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. Women who were raped could seek justice through both secular and church courts. Though the burden of proof was often difficult to meet and social stigma could be devastating, while the church preached celibacy for clergy and promoted virginity as the highest spiritual state, it also celebrated marriage as a holy sacrament and acknowledged sexual pleasure within marriage as divinely ordained. This led to complex negotiations between spiritual ideals and human desires, with many people finding ways to honor both their faith and their physical needs. It was a nuanced aspect of life that people navigated through a combination of religious teachings, practical considerations, folk wisdom, and genuine human emotion. Medieval intimacy was governed by a complex web of practicalities, traditions, and spiritual beliefs that shaped every aspect of romantic and sexual expression. Sexual activity was officially sanctioned only within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation. The clergy designated numerous days throughout the year when sexual relations were forbidden, including Sundays, holy days, feast days, fast days, and during pregnancy and menstruation. Women used dangerous herbal concoctions, physical manipulation, and other risky methods to terminate unwanted pregnancies. Knights and troubadours celebrated passionate, often unconsummated love for unattainable ladies, usually the wives of their lords. Clerical celibacy, officially mandated but widely ignored, created a class of men who were supposed to guide others in sexual morality while denying their own natural desires. Young women were expected to remain virgins until marriage, with their purity serving as a form of currency in marriage negotiations. The cult of the Virgin Mary reinforced these expectations, holding up female chastity as the highest virtue. However, the realities of medieval life often made such purity difficult to maintain. Rape was common, especially during times of war or social upheaval, and the victims were often blamed rather than supported. Married women faced different challenges. They were expected to be sexually available to their husbands, while remaining modest and restrained in their own desires. The concept of female pleasure was acknowledged in some medieval medical texts, but it was generally seen as secondary to male satisfaction and the goal of procreation. Women who displayed too much sexual appetite were often labeled as lustful or even demonic. Many priests, bishops, and even popes maintained long-term relationships with women. It's often called housekeepers or nieces, who functioned as unofficial wives. Widows in particular often enjoyed greater sexual freedom than their married or unmarried counterparts. Having proven their fertility and fulfilled their primary social function, they could sometimes choose their own partners or remain independent. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created natural patterns for sexual activity and reproduction. Spring and summer, with their abundance of food and warmer weather, were preferred times for weddings and conception. Winter births were avoided when possible, as the harsh conditions made infant survival less. These arrangements were widely known and often tolerated, as creating a disconnect between official doctrine and actual practice. Medieval attitudes toward homosexuality were complex and contradictory. While sodomy was officially condemned as a grave sin, same-sex relationships existed throughout society, often hidden within accepted social structures. Monasteries and convents, their single-sex communities and emphasis on intense spiritual relationships, sometimes provided cover for romantic attachments. The concept of passionate friendship, celebrated in religious and secular literature, allowed for deep emotional bonds that might include physical expression while maintaining the appearance of propriety. These relationships, conducted through elaborate rituals of service, poetry, and symbolic gestures, allowed for emotional intimacy, while maintaining the fiction of propriety. However, the reality behind courtly love was often more pragmatic than poetic. Noble households provided numerous opportunities for actual affairs with servants, visiting ladies, and even relatives, creating a complex web of sexual relationships that operated alongside the official marriage structure. Bastard children were common and often acknowledged, though their inheritance rights remained limited. The high maternal mortality rate meant that many women died from these attempts. But the desperate circumstances of medieval life sometimes made such risks seem preferable to the alternative of another mouth to feed. For the nobility, sexual relationships operated under different rules and constraints. Noble marriages were diplomatic tools designed to forge alliances, secure territories, or strengthen political positions. These arrangements often involved children who had never met, with wedding ceremonies conducted by proxy when the participants lived in different countries. Young noblewomen, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, found themselves married to men they had never seen, in lands where they didn't speak the language. By some calculations, these restrictions left fewer than 90 days per year when intimate relations were officially permitted. However, evidence suggests that many couples ignored these prohibitions when practical considerations demanded it. The rhythm of agricultural life, with its intense seasonal demands, often took precedence over ecclesiastical calendars. Harvest time, when entire communities worked together from dawn to dusk, created its own schedule for human relationships. While the Church preached strict moral codes, the reality of daily life required a more nuanced approach to human relationships and desires. Physicians believed in the theory of humors, suggesting that sexual activity was necessary to maintain the proper balance of bodily fluids. They prescribed sexual intercourse as a cure for various ailments, from melancholy to digestive problems. Women were thought to have an insatiable sexual appetite that needed to be carefully controlled, while men were seen as naturally lustful but capable of rational restraint. Contraception, while officially condemned by the Church, was widely practiced through various folk methods. Women used herbal preparations, pessaries made from honey and herbs, and timing methods based on lunar cycles or bodily signs. The effectiveness of these techniques varied greatly, but their widespread use indicates that medieval people understood the connection between sexual activity and pregnancy and sought to control their fertility when circumstances demanded it. In the countryside, where most people lived, finding privacy for intimate moments presented constant challenges. Peasant families shared single-room dwellings with their children, elderly relatives, and often their livestock. The concept of a private bedroom was virtually unknown to the common folk. Couples had to be creative, stealing moments of solitude in barns, fields, or forests when circumstances allowed. Even then, they risked discovery by neighbors, family members, or the watchful eyes of the Church. Medieval people understood sexuality as part of a larger cosmic order that connected human behavior to natural cycles, celestial movements, and divine will. Parents typically arranged matches based on practical considerations: the size of a dowry, the quality of land holdings, or the need for additional labor. Young people had little say in these decisions, though some managed to influence their parents' choices through persistent appeals or strategic alliances with sympathetic relatives. Despite these constraints, genuine affection often developed between spouses over time. Shared hardships, the birth of children, and years of working side by side created bonds that transcended the original economic motivations. Medieval literature, while often idealized, suggests that many couples found deep satisfaction in their partnerships, even when they began as strangers. Sexual activity was thought to be influenced by moon phases, seasonal changes, and astrological configurations. This holistic view meant that intimate relationships were seen not just as personal matters, but as part of the broader harmony between humans and the natural world. Same-sex relationships existed throughout medieval society, though they were officially condemned by both church and secular authorities. Despite legal prohibitions, evidence suggests that romantic and sexual relationships between people of the same gender occurred across all social levels. These relationships often operated within existing social structures, such as monastic communities, noble households, or craft guilds, where close same-sex friendships provided cover for more intimate connections. The intersection of sexuality and spirituality created fascinating contradictions in medieval life. The economic aspects of sexuality were equally complex. Marriage involved detailed negotiations over dowries, inheritance rights, and property ownership. Sexual relationships outside marriage could have significant financial implications. From the costs of supporting illegitimate children to the economic arrangements surrounding prostitution, even within marriage, sexual behavior could affect economic standing through its impact on fertility, inheritance, and family alliances. As medieval society gradually evolved, So too did attitudes towards sexuality and relationships. The rise of urban centers increased literacy, and growing merchant classes began to challenge traditional rural and aristocratic models of marriage and family life. New forms of romantic literature celebrated passionate love and individual choice, while changing economic conditions gave some people more freedom in selecting partners and organizing their intimate lives. The legacy of medieval sexuality continues to influence Western attitudes toward love, marriage, and intimate relationships. Many of our contemporary debates about sexual morality, gender roles, and the balance between individual desire and social responsibility echo discussions that began in medieval monasteries, universities, and households. Understanding this rich and complex history helps us appreciate both how much has changed and how much remains constant in the fundamental human experiences of love, desire, and intimate connection. Human sexuality in medieval times was neither the repressed, joyless experience sometimes portrayed in popular culture, nor the completely unregulated free-for-all that some might imagine. Marriage among the peasantry was primarily an economic arrangement designed to merge resources and ensure survival, rather than celebrate romantic love. The Church's teachings on sexuality created a complicated landscape for medieval couples. Medieval medical understanding of sexuality was rudimentary and often bizarred by modern standards. Abortion, though strictly forbidden and severely punished when discovered, occurred regularly throughout medieval society. The concept of courtly love, popularized in medieval literature and song, provided an outlet for romantic feelings that couldn't be expressed within these arranged marriages. The Church itself struggled with sexuality in ways that influenced broader medieval attitudes. Women's sexuality was particularly constrained by medieval social structures. Despite these constraints, evidence suggests that many medieval women found ways to express their sexuality and maintain some control over their reproductive lives. Widows, in particular, often enjoyed greater sexual freedom than their married or unmarried counterparts. Having proven their fertility and fulfilled their primary social function, they could sometimes choose their own partners or remain independent. Women understood the connection between menstruation and fertility. Even if their specific understanding was often inaccurate, they used various methods to track their cycles and time sexual activity accordingly. Physicians believed that women were essentially incomplete men, with their reproductive organs being internal versions of male anatomy. Medieval Christians lived under a complex calendar of sexual restrictions that would seem almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Newly married couples received detailed instruction from older relatives about their conjugal duties. The bedding ceremony, though it strikes us today as invasive and humiliating, served important social functions in medieval society. Herbal remedies for preventing pregnancy circulated widely among women, passed down through generations of mothers and midwives. Queen Anne's lace, pennyroyal, and tansy were commonly used, though their effectiveness varied wildly, and some proved dangerous or even fatal. A woman's sexual reputation could elevate or destroy her entire family's position in society. Virginity before marriage was prized not just for moral reasons, but as a form of social currency, traded between families to cement alliances and secure advantageous matches. The public nature of medieval life meant that sexual misconduct was difficult to conceal, leading to elaborate systems of surveillance and gossip that policed community morality. Young people navigated these treacherous waters with varying degrees of success. Courtship rituals provided structured opportunities for potential partners to interact while maintaining appropriate boundaries. The practice of bundling, where courting couples shared a bed while fully clothed and often separated by a wooden board, allowed for intimate conversation and emotional connection without crossing sexual lines. These customs acknowledged the natural desires of young people, while providing safeguards against impropriety. Barrier methods, using animal membranes or cloths soaked in acidic solutions, were known, but rarely discussed openly. Official teachings preached restraint and viewed sexual pleasure with suspicion. Yet the same authorities who condemned carnal desire often lived quite different private lives. The gap between public morality and private behavior created spaces where medieval people could explore their sexuality within carefully maintained boundaries of discretion and denial. These contradictions extended to the treatment of sexual minorities and non-normative behaviors. While homosexual acts were universally condemned in the Church's position on contraception was complex and sometimes contradictory. While officially condemning any attempt to prevent pregnancy, religious authorities occasionally acknowledged practical realities. Families already struggling to feed existing children might receive tacit approval for spacing births more widely. Wealthy women whose frequent pregnancies threatened their health and their family's political stability sometimes found sympathetic confessors willing to provide guidance on family planning. Witnesses confirmed the marriage's consummation, protecting both parties from future accusations of fraud or impotence. The concept of quickening, when fetal movement could first be felt, served as a crucial dividing line. Before quickening, the fetus was not considered fully ensouled, making early termination a serious sin, but not equivalent to murder. After quickening, abortion was treated as infanticide, carrying the most severe spiritual and legal penalties. This distinction created a narrow window during which pregnancy could be ended without completely damning consequences. Though the physical dangers remained extreme, the procedures themselves were crude and often lethal. Herbal abortifacients like ergot and senna were highly toxic, killing the mother as often as terminating the pregnancy. Physical methods involving sharp instruments or violent abdominal pressure frequently resulted in hemorrhaging, infection, or death. The mortality rate for intentional abortion was staggering, making it truly a last resort for desperate women. The blessing of the marriage bed by clergy added divine sanction to what might otherwise be seen as purely carnal activity. But even within marriage, the Church maintained strict guidelines about acceptable sexual behavior. The missionary position was the only approved method of intercourse. As it was believed to facilitate procreation while minimizing pleasure, any variation was considered potentially sinful, ranging from minor transgressions requiring brief penance to serious sins demanding extensive spiritual purification. Oral sex was universally condemned, seen as a perversion that reduced humans to the level of animals. Even excessive enthusiasm during approved sexual acts could be problematic, as pleasure for its own sake was viewed with deep suspicion. During Lent, Advent, and other holy seasons, marital relations were strictly forbidden. While they acknowledged that women needed to experience some level of satisfaction for conception to occur, they worried about the spiritual implications of female desire. Medical texts from the period reveal a fascinating tension between practical knowledge and religious doctrine. Physicians understood that female orgasm was often necessary for pregnancy. Yet they struggled to reconcile this biological reality with theological teachings about the inherent sinfulness of sexual pleasure. Some medical authorities developed elaborate theories about the timing and nature of female climax. They believed that simultaneous orgasm between husband and wife produced the strongest children, leading to detailed instructions about sexual technique that seem remarkably progressive for their time. These texts advised husbands to engage in extended foreplay, to pay attention to their wives' responses, and to time their own release carefully. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that the Church's obsession with procreation led to some of the most detailed sex manuals of the medieval period. Wednesdays and Fridays were considered inappropriate for intimacy, as were Sundays and any feast days honoring saints. Women during menstruation, pregnancy, and while nursing were deemed sexually unavailable. When you tally up all these prohibited periods, medieval couples found themselves with precious few sanctioned opportunities for physical intimacy. Yet human nature, as it always does, found ways to circumvent these rigid constraints. Folk traditions and local customs often provided loopholes that the Church grudgingly tolerated. Certain feast days, particularly those marking seasonal transitions, became occasions for more relaxed moral oversight. The spring festivals celebrating fertility offered temporary reprieve from sexual restrictions. Harvest celebrations, with their emphasis on abundance and procreation, created spaces where normal rules bent under the weight of communal joy and perhaps a bit too much ale. This perspective influenced treatments for sexual problems and shaped attitudes toward gender roles and sexuality. Despite all these constraints and challenges, medieval people found ways to experience joy, pleasure, and deep connection in their intimate relationships. Love letters, court records, and literary works from the period reveal individuals who navigated the complex rules of their society while maintaining their humanity and desire for meaningful relationships. They celebrated sexuality within the bounds available to them, whether through the sanctioned channels of marriage or the hidden pathways of forbidden love. The legacy of medieval sexuality continued to influence European attitudes toward relationships, marriage, and sexual expression for centuries to come. The tension between spiritual ideals and human reality, the emphasis on marriage as an economic institution, and the complex regulation of sexual behavior all became deeply embedded in Western culture. Herbal remedies passed down through generations of women provided options for preventing or terminating pregnancy, though their effectiveness and safety varied greatly. The role of midwives and wise women in medieval sexuality extended far beyond childbirth assistance. These women served as repositories of knowledge about female sexuality, contraception, and reproductive health. They provided advice, remedies, and support to women navigating the challenges of medieval sexual life. However, this knowledge also made them targets during periods of witch persecution, as their understanding of herbs in the female body was sometimes viewed as supernatural or demonic. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created natural patterns for sexual activity and reproduction. Spring and summer, with their abundance of food and warmer weather, were preferred times for weddings and conception. Winter births were avoided when possible, as the harsh conditions made infant survival less likely. These patterns, driven by practical considerations rather than romantic preferences, shaped the timing of intimate relationships throughout the medieval period. Medieval contraceptive knowledge, while limited by modern standards, was more sophisticated than often assumed. Medieval bathhouses, common in many European cities, provided venues for sexual encounters outside the constraints of home and family. These establishments, while officially dedicated to hygiene, often served as informal brothels or meeting places for illicit relationships. The Church periodically attempted to regulate or close these facilities, recognizing their role in facilitating sexual activity outside marriage. Prostitution was widespread throughout medieval Europe, operating within a complex legal and social framework. While officially condemned by the Church, it was often regulated by civil authorities who recognized its inevitability and potential for taxation. Many cities designated specific areas for prostitutes to operate, providing some protection while maintaining social order. The women who entered this profession came from various backgrounds, though poverty and limited alternatives drove many to this dangerous livelihood. The medieval understanding of sexual anatomy was deeply flawed, based on classical texts that had been copied and recopied for centuries without empirical verification. The Church's influence over sexuality extended far beyond mere doctrine into the very fabric of daily existence. The wedding night itself was surrounded by elaborate rituals, designed to ensure both spiritual blessing and physical satisfaction. The concept of female sexual pleasure presented medieval theologians with a particularly thorny problem. Medieval contraception existed in a gray area between accepted medical practice and forbidden interference with divine will. Abortion occupied an even more precarious position in medieval moral thinking. Medieval sexuality was deeply intertwined with concepts of honor, shame, and social standing. The reality of medieval sexuality, as with so many aspects of life in this period, was marked by profound contradictions between ideal and practice. Official teachings preached restraint and viewed sexual pleasure with suspicion. Yet the same authorities who condemned carnal desire often lived quite different private lives. The gap between public morality and private behavior created spaces where medieval people could explore sexuality within carefully maintained boundaries of discretion and denial. These contradictions extended to the treatment of sexual minorities and non-normative behaviors. While homosexual acts were universally condemned in official doctrine, the practical enforcement of these prohibitions varied enormously. Because beyond the grand narratives of courtly love and church, doctrine lay a world where sexuality was fundamentally intertwined with survival, social mobility, and the harsh realities of daily existence. It wasn't uncommon for family members and witnesses to escort the couple to their marriage bed, sometimes even remaining nearby to ensure the consummation actually took place. This wasn't mere voyeurism, though it might seem so to our contemporary eyes. The Church preached that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, was inherently sinful. When sexual expression was finally permitted, it often occurred with an intensity born of long abstinence. This wasn't just about knights pining for unattainable ladies, though that was certainly part of it. Heloise writes with startling honesty about sexual pleasure. about the ways physical desire intertwined with intellectual passion, about her frustration with religious life that demanded she deny her sexual nature. Medieval people developed remarkable abilities to create intimate moments within public spaces, to communicate desire through glances and gestures, to find passion in stolen moments. The very restrictions they faced often intensified the sexual charge of their relationships in ways that unlimited privacy might not have achieved. The clothing of the period also shaped sexual experience in fascinating ways. Medieval garments were complex affairs, involving multiple layers, ties, and fastenings that made undressing a slow, deliberate process. This wasn't just practical protection against cold and dirt, but a system that built anticipation and required cooperation between partners. The gradual removal of each layer became part of the sexual ritual, creating foreplay that could last far longer than the final act itself. Women's clothing, in particular, was designed with sexual access in mind. Many medieval gowns featured strategic openings and lacings that allowed for intimate contact without complete undressing. This practical design reflected a culture that understood sexuality as something that needed to be accommodated within the constraints of daily life, not something that required complete withdrawal from normal activities. These weren't the words of a woman who saw sexuality as inherently shameful, but of someone who understood it as a fundamental part of human experience that could elevate the soul as well as satisfy the body. The medieval bedroom itself tells us much about sexual attitudes. In wealthy households, beds were massive, ornate affairs that served multiple functions beyond sleep and sex. They were status symbols, legal spaces where contracts were signed and witnesses gathered, and semi-public areas where important conversations took place. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Servants, children, and guests might share sleeping spaces, creating an environment where sexual activity required careful timing and discretion rather than true solitude. Courtly love created a space where sexual desire could be acknowledged, celebrated, and refined without necessarily being consummated. It was a sophisticated game of sexual tension that could last for years, involving elaborate codes of conduct, secret messages, and stolen moments that were charged with erotic energy precisely because they remained unconsummated. Take the famous relationship between Heloise and Abelard in 12th century Paris. Their passionate affair, which began when he was her teacher and she his brilliant student, scandalized society, not just because it was illicit, but because it challenged every assumption about how sexual relationships should work. Heloise was intellectually equal to Abelard, possibly his superior, and their letters reveal a woman who understood her own sexuality with remarkable clarity. When their affair was discovered and Abelard was castrated by Heloise's outraged family, their correspondence continued for decades, creating one of history's most extraordinary documents of sexual and intellectual intimacy. The medieval calendar of sexuality wasn't just about restriction. It was about creating rhythms of denial and release that heightened both anticipation and pleasure. Some historians argue that this cyclical pattern actually intensified sexual satisfaction in ways that our modern culture of sexual availability rarely matches. But what happened during all those forbidden periods? Human nature, as we know, rarely conforms perfectly to official doctrine. The evidence suggests that medieval people found countless ways to express intimacy, while technically adhering to church law. They developed elaborate practices of what we might call technical virginity, engaging in sexual activities that stopped just short of full intercourse. They explored forms of mutual pleasure that didn't involve penetration, creating an underground culture of sexuality that existed parallel to official teachings. The ideal Christian couple was supposed to approach marital relations with reluctance, performing their duty for procreation while taking no joy in the act itself. This created a psychological battlefield where couples navigated between medical advice, encouraging mutual pleasure, and religious doctrine, condemning it. Consider the seasonal rhythms that govern medieval sexuality. The Church designated numerous periods throughout the year when sexual relations were forbidden, even between married couples. These included not just major religious seasons like Lent and Advent, but also Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays throughout the year. Add to this the prohibition during a woman's menstrual period, pregnancy, and breastfeeding, and you have a calendar where legitimate sexual activity was restricted to perhaps fewer than half the days in any given year. Rather, it reflected the profound social and economic importance of sexual union in cementing alliances and ensuring legitimate heirs. The bedsheets might be examined the following morning for proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation, physical evidence that held legal weight in disputes over inheritance and property rights. But Eleonora's experience would have been shaped by more than just social expectations. The medieval understanding of female sexuality was a fascinating contradiction. Simultaneously acknowledging women's sexual desires while attempting to control and channel them, picture, if you will, a young woman in 13th century England. Let's call her Eleonora. This wasn't progressive thinking in our modern sense, but rather a practical concern rooted in the desperate need for legitimate heirs in a world where infant mortality rates soared and political stability often hung by the thread of dynastic succession. Medieval physicians believed that both partners needed to reach climax for pregnancy to occur, leading to advice that might seem surprisingly enlightened. Texts like those of Albertus Magnus counseled men to be patient and attentive lovers to ensure their wives' satisfaction not just for pleasure's sake, but as a medical necessity. This created an interesting dynamic where male sexual performance was judged not just by dominance or virility, but by their ability to bring their partners to fulfillment. At 14, she's already considered of marriageable age, her value measured not by her personal desires, but by the strategic alliances her union might forge. Eleonora's father, a minor landowner struggling to maintain his holdings, sees her marriage as a crucial economic transaction. Her dowry, carefully calculated and saved for years, represents a significant portion of the family's wealth. This wasn't romance as we understand it today, but rather a complex negotiation where sexuality served as currency in the medieval economy of power. Close same-sex friendships were common and often intense, providing cover for relationships that may have crossed into sexual territory. The all-male environment of monasteries and the military created opportunities for intimate bonds that existed in the shadows of official disapproval. Medieval attitudes toward masturbation reflected similar tensions between theological condemnation and practical reality. Church teachings classified self-pleasure as a serious sin requiring confession and penance. Yet the punishments prescribed were often relatively mild compared to other sexual transgressions. Medical authorities sometimes recommended masturbation for health reasons, particularly for unmarried men whose sexual frustration was believed to cause physical illness. This created yet another area where religious doctrine and practical medicine found themselves at odds. The legacy of medieval sexuality continues to influence Western attitudes towards sex and relationships centuries later. The Christian emphasis on sexual restraint, the suspicion of pleasure for its own sake, and the complex negotiations between desire and duty all have their roots in this formative period. Understanding how our medieval ancestors navigated these challenges provides insight not only into their world, but into the historical foundations of our own complicated relationship with human sexuality. As we look back on medieval sexuality from our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on the restrictions and repressions that seem so foreign to contemporary sensibilities. Yet within those constraints, medieval people found ways to love, desire, and connect with one another. Their struggles to balance spiritual obligations with human needs, to find meaning in relationships beyond mere procreation, and to create intimacy within rigid social structures speak to universal aspects of the human experience that transcend any particular historical moment. The medieval period reminds us that sexuality has always been more than just a biological drive or even a source of pleasure. It has been a realm where power, spirituality, love, and identity intersect in complex and often contradictory ways. Now, let's delve deeper into the intimate realities that shaped medieval sexuality in ways that might surprise you. The wedding night itself was a public affair in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. Medical texts of the time, heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sources, actually insisted that female pleasure was necessary for conception. Yet this medical understanding existed alongside deeply contradictory religious teachings. This created what we might call a pressure cooker effect. The rise of courtly love in the 12th and 13th centuries added another layer of complexity to medieval sexuality. Their letters reveal aspects of medieval sexuality that official sources rarely acknowledge. Yet, this lack of privacy didn't necessarily diminish sexual satisfaction. The very restrictions they faced often intensified the sexual charge of their relationships in ways that unlimited privacy might not have achieved. The clothing of the period also shaped sexual experience in fascinating ways. Men were expected to be sexually aggressive and dominant, yet also restrained and responsible. Far from being a marginal activity, commercial sex was an integral part of medieval society. While officially condemning commercial sex, many religious authorities tacitly accepted it as a necessary evil that prevented worse sins like adultery and rape. Some church leaders even argued that prostitution protected the virtue of respectable women by providing an outlet for male sexual desires that might otherwise be directed toward wives and daughters of good families. This pragmatic approach extended to the regulation of medieval brothels. Some church authorities grudgingly acknowledged that a certain amount of enjoyment was necessary to ensure conception, leading to detailed discussions about timing, technique, and even the importance of mutual satisfaction. The influential theologian Thomas Aquinas argued that, while excessive sexual pleasure was sinful, the complete absence of pleasure might indicate a lack of proper marital affection, which was also problematic. Rural communities had long-standing traditions of bundling, where courting couples would spend the night together in bed, separated only by a wooden board or bundled in separate blankets. This practice allowed young people to get to know each other intimately, while theoretically preserving virginity. Though the frequency of pregnant brides suggests that the theoretical and practical aspects of bundling often diverged significantly, these texts ranged from straightforward practical advice to elaborate, allegorical works that used religious or mythological imagery to discuss sexual techniques and philosophy. The influential speculum Alchemia provided detailed guidance on everything from personal hygiene to advanced sexual positions, while works like De Secretis Mulierum explored the mysteries of female sexuality, with a combination of medical knowledge and folkloric wisdom. Perhaps most surprisingly, medieval culture developed a rich tradition of sexual humor and parody that provided another outlet. 4. Expressions of sexuality that would otherwise be forbidden. Foblio's popular comic tales, often performed by traveling entertainers, featured elaborate plots revolving around adultery, sexual trickery, and the battle of the sexes. These stories allowed audiences to laugh at sexual situations that would be condemned in more serious contexts, while also providing a form of sexual education through their detailed descriptions of various encounters and techniques. Village festivals and seasonal celebrations provided regular opportunities for sexual expression that the church could never entirely suppress. These events served as safety valves for a society that otherwise imposed strict controls on sexual expression, allowing young people in particular to meet potential partners and engage in flirtation and courtship that might otherwise be impossible. This created a narrow window of acceptable sexuality that couples were expected to navigate with the precision of theological scholars, which held that sexual desire and performance were directly related to the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry elements in the body. Men were considered naturally hot and dry, making them more sexually aggressive and prone to lust, while women were thought to be cold and wet, supposedly making them less interested in sex, but more capable of conception when properly heated through foreplay and passion. This led to detailed discussions about diet, exercise, and even astrological timing as ways to optimize sexual performance and fertility. Medical treatises of the period reveal a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of female sexuality, contradicting the modern stereotype of medieval ignorance about women's bodies. Physicians understood the importance of female orgasm for conception, leading to detailed advice about techniques for ensuring mutual satisfaction. Some medical texts even included diagrams and explicit instructions that would not seem out of place in modern sex manuals. The famous physician Avicenna wrote extensively about the importance of emotional connection and gradual arousal, while other authorities discussed the optimal frequency of sexual relations for different ages and temperaments. The concept of courtly love emerged as a fascinating counterpoint to the Church's restrictive teachings, creating an entirely separate sexual culture among the nobility. This elaborate system of romantic devotion typically involved a knight's passionate, often unrequited love for a married noblewoman of higher social standing. The entire framework was built around the tension between desire and denial, creating an erotic charge through elaborate rituals of worship, secret messages, stolen glances, and carefully orchestrated encounters that stopped just short of physical consummation. The literature of courtly love is filled with metaphors of burning passion, sleepless nights, and the exquisite agony of unfulfilled desire. Many were actually owned by religious institutions or noble families, creating a system where moral authorities profited from activities they officially condemned. The very impossibility of fulfillment was seen as what elevated these relationships above the mundane realities of arranged marriages and conjugal duty. Troubadours composed elaborate songs celebrating the beauty and virtue of unattainable ladies, while romance literature explored every nuance of forbidden desire. The famous affair between Lancelot and Guinevere in Arthurian legend epitomized this tradition, presenting adultery not as sin, but as the inevitable result of true love encountering the artificial barriers of social convention. Of course, the reality behind these romantic ideals was often more pragmatic. Many relationships that began as courtly love affairs eventually became fully sexual, conducted with varying degrees of discretion, depending on the social status and political connections of the participants. The elaborate ritual of courtly love provided a sophisticated framework for extramarital relationships that allowed both parties to maintain their reputations while pursuing their desires. A lady could receive gifts, poetry, and devoted attention from multiple suitors without necessarily compromising her virtue, while knights could demonstrate their refinement and emotional depth through their romantic pursuits. The women who worked in these establishments occupied a complex social position, simultaneously marginalized and essential. Despised and depended upon, most major cities had designated red light districts, often officially sanctioned and regulated by local authorities. It was a world where pleasure and pragmatism intertwined, where religious ideals battled human nature, and where sexuality served functions far beyond personal satisfaction. The medieval approach to sex was deeply embedded in social structures, economic realities, and spiritual beliefs in ways that created both extraordinary constraints and unexpected freedoms. The legacy of these medieval sexual attitudes would shape Western culture for centuries to come, creating patterns of desire, shame, and fulfillment that continue to influence our most intimate relationships today. These weren't hidden underground operations, but legitimate businesses that served crucial social functions. The medieval attitude toward sexuality was far more complex and contradictory than most people realize today. While the Church preached chastity and condemned carnal desire as the devil's snare, the reality on the ground was a world where human passion found countless ways to express itself despite official disapproval. This tension between religious doctrine and human nature created a fascinating landscape of sexual practices, beliefs, and behaviors that shaped every aspect of medieval life. At the heart of medieval sexual culture lay a fundamental paradox. The same church that vilified sexual pleasure also celebrated marriage as a holy sacrament, creating an official space where sexuality could be expressed, albeit under strict conditions. Marriage was considered the only legitimate outlet for sexual desire. But even within this sanctified bond, the rules were numerous and complex. Couples were forbidden from engaging in sexual relations on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, and throughout various other religious observances that could amount to nearly half the year. The Church taught that sex should be conducted only for procreation in the missionary position, preferably in darkness, and certainly without any display of enthusiasm or pleasure that might suggest the participants were enjoying themselves too much. Medieval prostitution wasn't just about providing sexual release for unmarried men, though that was certainly part of its purpose. It also served as a kind of sexual education system, where young men could learn techniques and gain experience before marriage. The more expensive courtesans were often highly educated women who provided not just sexual services, but companionship, conversation, and cultural refinement that many marriages couldn't offer. The ideal medieval man was supposed to channel his sexual energy into productive activities, warfare, governance, and the protection of women and children. Sexual excess was seen as a sign of weakness and poor character, while sexual inadequacy was equally shameful. This created intense pressure on medieval men to perform sexually, while maintaining strict control over their desires. The literature of the period is full of anxiety about sexual performance, about the shame of premature climax or inability to satisfy one's wife. These weren't just personal concerns, but social ones. as a man's sexual competence was seen as directly related to his ability to govern his household and fulfill his social obligations. Medieval garments were complex affairs, involving multiple layers, ties, and fastenings that made undressing a slow, deliberate process. This wasn't just practical protection against cold and dirt, but a system that built anticipation and required cooperation between partners. The gradual removal of each layer became part of the sexual ritual, creating foreplay that could last far longer than the final act itself. Women's clothing, in particular, was designed with sexual access in mind. Many medieval gowns featured strategic openings and lacings that allowed for intimate contact without complete undressing. This practical design reflected a culture that understood sexuality as something that needed to be accommodated within the constraints of daily life, not something that required complete withdrawal from normal activities. The medieval understanding of male sexuality was equally complex and contradictory. The role of prostitution in medieval sexuality adds another layer to our understanding. The Church's attitude toward prostitution was characteristically contradictory. As we delve deeper into these intimate realities, we begin to see that medieval sexuality was far more nuanced and sophisticated than popular imagination suggests. Medieval sexual culture was a world of contradictions and hidden passions. Yet despite these restrictions, medieval marriage manuals reveal a surprisingly nuanced understanding of sexual compatibility and pleasure. What made courtly love particularly subversive was its celebration of adulterous passion as the highest form of romantic expression. The common people developed their own approaches to sexuality that were often more straightforward and practical than either church doctrine or courtly romance. The medieval understanding of human sexuality was deeply influenced by the classical theory of the four humors. The medieval period also saw the development of an extensive literature of sexual instruction, much of it disguised as medical or theological writing to avoid church censorship. These texts ranged from straightforward practical advice to elaborate allegorical works that used religious or mythological imagery to discuss sexual techniques and philosophy. The influential Speculum Alchemia provided detailed guidance on everything from personal hygiene to advanced sexual positions, while works like De Secretis Mulierum explored the mysteries of female sexuality with a combination of medical knowledge and folkloric wisdom. When couples violated social norms through inappropriate marriages, adultery, or other sexual misconduct, the community would gather outside their homes to make noise with pots, and crude instruments, while singing satirical songs about the offender's behavior. The tradition of the Lady-S Champion allowed knights to dedicate their martial prowess to a particular woman. Wearing her colors in battle and seeking her blessing before dangerous enterprises, sodomy was officially condemned as one of the worst possible sins. The reality was more nuanced. The Church may have preached restraint and purity, but behind closed doors and in the shadows of society, passion found its way like water through stone. The Church had designated no fewer than half the days of the year as inappropriate for marital relations. Sundays were forbidden, as were Wednesdays and Fridays. They understood that sexual satisfaction was important for both men's and women's health and well-being. In the villages and towns where most medieval people lived, knowledge about intimacy was passed down through generations of mothers to daughters, shared among women as they worked together, spinning, weaving, and tending children. Among the nobility, marriages were primarily political and economic arrangements. But this didn't mean that passion was entirely absent from aristocratic life. Court records are filled with cases of young people who were brought before ecclesiastical authorities for fornication, suggesting that such behavior was common enough to require regular intervention. The practice of handfasting, or informal marriage contracts, allowed couples to live together and consummate their relationship before formal church ceremonies, a practice that the Church gradually worked to eliminate, but never fully succeeded in suppressing. Same-sex relationships, while officially condemned and theoretically punishable by death, existed in the medieval world much as they do in any human society. The evidence is necessarily fragmentary given the dangerous nature of such. Indeed, the culture of courtly love that flourished in the high medieval period celebrated romantic and sexual desire, albeit in a highly stylized and often frustrated form. Knights would pledge themselves to unattainable ladies, writing poetry about their longing and performing great deeds to win their favor. While these relationships were supposedly chaste, the literature is filled with barely concealed sexual tension and desire. For peasants and working people, sexuality was approached with more pragmatism, but perhaps greater freedom in some ways. Without the complex political considerations that governed noble marriages, common folk could sometimes marry for affection and attraction. Their intimate lives were less scrutinized by church authorities, and the demands of survival often took precedence over religious strictures. In the cramped quarters where peasant families lived, privacy was non-existent, and children grew up with a frank understanding of adult relationships that would shock later, more prudish generations. This oral tradition preserved practical knowledge about contraception, fertility, and sexual health that often contradicted or supplemented official teachings. Contraception, though officially forbidden by the Church, was widely practiced using methods that ranged from the surprisingly effective to the utterly useless. Women knew to insert pessaries made of honey, crocodile dung, or various herbal concoctions before intercourse. They understood the rhythm method, though imperfectly, and timed their relations to avoid their most fertile periods. Herbal remedies like Queen Anne's lace seeds, pennyroyal, and rue were consumed as early abortifacients. Some of these folk remedies have since been validated by modern science, while others were dangerous or ineffective. But they represent a determination to control fertility that transcended religious prohibitions. Medical treatises discuss the female anatomy with a level of detail and accuracy that might surprise modern readers. They recognized the clitoris, which they called the female member, and understood its role in female pleasure. Some medical texts even provided detailed instructions for achieving mutual satisfaction between spouses. Viewing sexual harmony as essential for a stable marriage and healthy offspring, the concept of female pleasure was not taboo in medieval medical thought, as it would become in later centuries. Physicians believed that women needed to achieve climax in order to conceive, based on the theory that both partners must release their seed for procreation to occur. This led to a remarkable frankness in discussing techniques for ensuring female satisfaction. Medieval medical manuals contained advice that would not seem out of place in a modern relationship guide, discussing foreplay, timing, and the importance of patience and consideration between partners. The 40 days of Lent, the weeks leading up to major feast days, the periods of Advent, and countless saints' days, all required abstinence. Women's monthly cycles imposed additional restrictions, as did pregnancy and nursing. When you calculated all these prohibitions, a medieval married couple might find themselves with fewer than 90 days a year when intimacy was officially sanctioned by the Church. Yet for all these restrictions, medieval people found ways to express their desires and maintain the bonds of physical affection that make us human. The evidence comes to us in fragments: whispered confessions recorded by priests, court records of moral transgressions, and the surprisingly frank medical texts that circulated among the educated classes. These sources paint a picture of a society where sexuality, though heavily regulated, remained a vital and acknowledged part of human experience. Tonight, let us pull back the heavy curtain that history has drawn over these most private moments and explore what truly happened when the candles were snuffed out and medieval folks sought comfort in each other's arms. The reality of medieval sexuality was far more nuanced than the simple narrative of religious repression that we often imagine. Yes, the Church wielded enormous influence over every aspect of daily life, including the most intimate. But human nature, with all its yearnings and desires, proved remarkably resilient against even the most rigid doctrinal constraints. In the flickering candlelight of medieval bedchambers, in the hay-scented darkness of barn lofts, in the secluded groves where lovers met, a different story unfolded entirely. Close same-sex friendships were celebrated in both religious and secular contexts, with elaborate rituals of brotherhood and sisterhood that often included sharing beds, exchanging vows, and expressing passionate devotion in language that would later be considered explicitly romantic. The line between acceptable friendship and forbidden sexuality was often unclear, allowing relationships to develop that might technically violate church teachings, while remaining socially acceptable as long as they were inexplicitly sexual. As medieval society gradually evolved toward the Renaissance, these various streams of sexual culture began to converge and transform in ways that would reshape European attitudes toward love, marriage, and sexuality for centuries to come. The tension between religious restriction and human desire that characterized medieval sexual culture never fully resolved. But it created a rich and complex landscape of sexual expression that defies simple categorization. From the highest courts to the humblest villages, medieval people found countless ways to pursue love, desire, and human connection within the constraints of their time, leaving behind a legacy that continues to influence our understanding of sexuality, romance, and the eternal human struggle between passion and propriety. The story of medieval sexuality is ultimately the story of human ingenuity in the face of repression, creativity in the pursuit of connection, and the irrepressible nature of desire itself. These relationships often involved elaborate ceremonies that resembled marriage rites, complete with the exchange of rings, public vows, and ritualized expressions of devotion that walked a fine line between romantic love and religious worship. Medieval attitudes toward prostitution reveal another fascinating aspect of the period's sexual culture. While officially condemned by the Church, prostitution was widely tolerated and even regulated by secular authorities who recognized it as a necessary social institution. Many cities established official red light districts with standardized prices, regular health inspections, and elaborate rules governing the behavior of both prostitutes and their clients. Some authorities even argued that prostitution served a valuable social function by providing an outlet for male sexual energy that might otherwise be directed toward the seduction of respectable women. These events often became elaborate festivals that lasted for days, featuring mock trials, comic performances, and plenty of opportunities for the participants to engage in their own forms of sexual misbehavior, while supposedly condemning it in others. The medieval church's approach to sexuality was further complicated by its simultaneous veneration of celibacy and its practical need to deal with the sexual realities of its clergy. While priests were officially required to remain celibate, the actual enforcement of this rule varied enormously, depending on time, place, and political circumstances. Many priests maintained long-term relationships with women who were euphemistically known as their housekeepers or nieces, while others were more discreet about their arrangements. Some bishops actively ignored clerical concubinage as long as it didn't create public scandal, while others launched vigorous reform campaigns that often had limited long-term success. Perhaps most surprisingly, medieval culture developed a rich tradition of sexual humor and parody that provided another outlet for expressions of sexuality that would otherwise be forbidden. Fabliaux, popular comic tales often performed by traveling entertainers, featured elaborate plots revolving around adultery, sexual trickery, and the battle of the sexes. These stories allowed audiences to laugh at sexual situations that would be condemned in more serious contexts, while also providing a form of sexual education through their detailed descriptions of various encounters and techniques. The tradition of chivalry, or rough music, demonstrates how communities policed sexual behavior while simultaneously creating opportunities for sexual expression. The rise of courtly culture also brought with it new forms of sexual expression that blurred the lines between spiritual and physical devotion. The medieval period's approach to same-sex relationships was similarly complex and contradictory. Now, as we've seen, the medieval world was one of stark contradictions and hidden complexities, nowhere more so than in the realm of human intimacy and desire. For married couples, intimacy was governed by a complex web of religious calendar restrictions that would seem almost comical today, if they were, and so thoroughly enforced. Medieval physicians, influenced by the classical writings of Galen and other ancient authorities, held surprisingly enlightened views about human sexuality by the standards of their time. But beyond the medical texts and official church teachings lay the rich world of folk wisdom and popular culture that shaped how ordinary people understood and experienced sexuality. The medieval approach to sexuality also varied dramatically by social class. The evidence suggests that premarital sexual experimentation was far more common than church teachings would suggest. Court records are filled with cases of young people who were brought before ecclesiastical authorities for fornication, suggesting that such behavior was common enough to require regular intervention. The practice of hand fasting, or informal marriage contracts, allowed couples to live together. The fabliaux, popular comic tales that circulated throughout medieval Europe, were filled with sexual humor, adultery. While the church condemned prostitution as sinful, secular authorities often regulated it as a necessary evil. Women were seen as naturally more lustful and sexually voracious than men, a view that seems counterintuitive today, but was widely accepted in medieval thought. Most people shared their sleeping spaces with family members, servants, or guests, making intimate moments a matter of careful timing and discretion. Despite the Church's thunderous condemnations and the very real threat of excommunication, medieval women possessed a remarkable body of knowledge about preventing and terminating pregnancies. This wasn't the desperate fumbling of the ignorant, rather a sophisticated understanding passed down through generations of mothers, midwives, and wise women. Some herbs were effective but toxic, causing severe illness or death if the dosage was miscalculated. While officially condemning all forms of birth control, individual priests might privately counsel troubled parishioners with more compassion than doctrine. While some women provided these services out of compassion or community obligation, others found in them a source of much-needed income. A skilled herbalist or midwife might charge substantial fees for her most sensitive services, creating a small but significant underground economy. The rare and exotic ingredients required for some procedures created their own networks of trade, with merchants and apothecaries serving as discreet intermediaries. These practices also revealed the sophisticated understanding medieval women had of their own bodies and reproductive cycles. Some theological authorities made careful distinctions between preventing conception and ending an established pregnancy, arguing that the soul didn't enter the body until quickening occurred. Others debated whether actions taken to restore a woman's health could be morally justified, even if they resulted in the loss of potential life. This underground world of reproductive knowledge also intersected with the broader practice of folk medicine and healing. The same wise women who helped prevent or end unwanted pregnancies also served as the primary healthcare providers for their communities. They assisted with difficult births, treated childhood illnesses, helped the elderly manage pain, and provided comfort to the dying. Their knowledge encompassed not just reproduction, but the full spectrum of human physical and emotional needs, making them indispensable even to those who might publicly condemn their practices. Mechanical methods of abortion involving the insertion of various implements carried enormous risks of infection and hemorrhage in an age before antiseptics or antibiotics. Many women died from these attempts, their deaths carefully explained as natural miscarriages or sudden illnesses to avoid scandal. Yet despite these dangers, the practice continued, sustained by networks of women who shared knowledge and provided mutual support. A midwife might quietly slip a packet of herbs to a desperate mother, accompanied by whispered instructions and warnings. Older women would teach younger ones the signs and timing that might prevent conception naturally. Market women might point a customer toward certain vendors who sold particular combinations of spices and herbs. Understanding passing between them without words, the methods they employed would seem both familiar and foreign to modern eyes. Herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were brewed into bitter teas that could bring on a woman's monthly courses when they had mysteriously ceased. Silphium, a now extinct plant from North Africa, was so prized for its contraceptive properties that it was literally worth its weight in gold and may have been harvested to extinction. Women inserted pessaries made from honey, acacia gum, and crocodile dung into their bodies, creating barriers that would prevent conception. They jumped backwards 7 times after intercourse, believing that motion could dislodge the seed. They wore amulets containing the testicles of weasels or the liver of a cat, trusting in sympathetic magic to transfer the animal's presumed sterility to themselves. Wealthy households might have more privacy, but even noble couples often shared their chambers with servants who slept nearby. The famous physician Avicenna wrote extensively about substances that could prevent conception. While always maintaining the pretense that such knowledge was purely theoretical, midwives and herbalists walked a dangerous tightrope, providing services that were desperately needed while avoiding the scrutiny of church authorities, who might brand them as murderers or witches. The reality was that for many medieval women, particularly those already struggling to feed existing children or facing the prospect of bearing a child out of wedlock, these methods represented not sin, but survival. A peasant woman, who already had 6 mouths to feed and a husband barely able to work their small plot of land, faced genuine starvation if another child arrived. A young servant girl seduced by her master's son faced not just shame, but complete social and economic ruin if she bore his child. For these women, the Church's teachings about accepting God's will rang hollow against the harsh mathematics of medieval survival. This lack of privacy required a different approach to intimacy, one that valued quiet discretion and careful timing over spontaneous passion. Despite all these constraints and complications, medieval people found ways to express their sexuality and maintain intimate relationships that brought joy, comfort, and connection to their often difficult lives. The evidence suggests that couples who genuinely cared for each other worked to create satisfying intimate relationships within the constraints of their time. They developed private signals and codes, found moments of solitude, and created emotional bonds that transcended the purely physical aspects of their relationships. The legacy of medieval sexuality is complex and often misunderstood. While it's true that the period was marked by religious restrictions and social controls that would seem oppressive today, it's also true that medieval people were not simply passive victims of these constraints. They found ways to express their humanity, their desires, and their need for intimate connection, despite the obstacles they faced. Their stories, fragmentary as they are, remind us that human sexuality is remarkably persistent and adaptable, finding expression even under the most challenging circumstances. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we might reflect on these long-ago lovers, who found each other in the darkness of medieval nights. Their passion may have been constrained by religious doctrine and social convention, but it was no less real for all that. In their whispered endearments, their stolen moments of intimacy, and their determination to find joy and connection despite the hardships of their time, we see reflections of our own deepest human needs and desires. This belief led to complex anxieties about female sexuality and the need to control it through marriage, religious life, or other social institutions. At the same time, it acknowledged women as sexual beings with their own desires and needs, rather than viewing them as passive recipients of male attention. The seasonal rhythms that governed so much of medieval life also influenced sexual practices. Spring festivals often included explicit sexual symbolism and opportunities for young people to meet and court potential partners. May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and other seasonal gatherings provided socially sanctioned opportunities for flirtation and romance that might lead to more intimate encounters. These traditions, many rooted in pre-Christian fertility religions, persisted despite church opposition and provided outlets for sexual expression within community contexts. Many medieval cities had designated red light districts where prostitution was tolerated and taxed. The authorities recognized that young men, especially those who could not afford to marry early, needed some outlet for their sexual desires. And controlled prostitution was seen as preferable to rape or adultery. The lives of medieval prostitutes varied widely, from high-class courtesans who served wealthy clients to desperate women forced into the trade by poverty. Some managed to accumulate considerable wealth and influence, while others lived in degrading conditions that would be shocking by modern standards. What's remarkable is how openly this trade was acknowledged and regulated, suggesting a more pragmatic approach to human sexuality than official church teachings would suggest. In ribald adventures that suggest ordinary people took a rather earthy view of human desire. These stories, while crude by modern standards, reveal a society that could laugh about sex and acknowledge its central role in human motivation and behavior. The concept of romantic love, as we understand it today, was largely a medieval invention. Emerging from the troubadour tradition of southern France and spreading throughout Europe, this literature celebrated passionate, often illicit love affairs and helped shape Western ideas about the connection between love and sexual desire. While courtly love poetry often emphasized the spiritual and ennobling aspects of romantic attraction, it also acknowledged the powerful physical component of love and desire. And consummate their relationship before formal church ceremonies, a practice that the church gradually worked to eliminate but never fully succeeded in suppressing. Same-sex relationships, while officially condemned and theoretically punishable by death, existed in the medieval world much as they do in any human society. The evidence is necessarily fragmentary given the dangerous nature of such relationships, but it appears in various forms throughout medieval records. Monasteries and convents, intended as havens of celibacy, sometimes became places where same-sex romantic relationships flourished. The close quarters, emotional intensity, and exclusion of the opposite sex created conditions where such bonds could develop despite official prohibitions. Medieval literature also provides glimpses into attitudes toward sexuality that reveal a more complex picture than simple repression. Prostitution was another aspect of medieval sexuality that reveals the gap between official morality and practical reality. Medieval attitudes towards sexuality were also shaped by the belief in the fundamental differences between men and women. The medieval bedroom itself was a space that differed dramatically from our modern expectations of privacy and romance. But perhaps nowhere was the clash between official doctrine and lived reality more evident than in the shadowy world of medieval abortion and contraception. Medieval medical texts, written by learned men who would never admit to endorsing such practices, nevertheless contained detailed instructions for these procedures, couched in careful language about restoring women's natural cycles and maintaining health. The procedures themselves were often dangerous, carried out in secrecy by women with varying levels of skill and knowledge. The Church, for its part, struggled with the reality that its own teachings created impossible situations for medieval women. The economic aspects of this hidden trade were equally complex. While some women provided these services out of compassion or community obligation, others found in them a source of much-needed income. A skilled herbalist or midwife might charge substantial fees for her most sensitive services, creating a small but significant underground economy. Women carrying the burden of unwanted pregnancies faced not just physical dangers, but enormous emotional strain. The secrecy required meant they often endured their fears and pain in isolation, unable to seek comfort from family or friends. While the Church preached acceptance of God's will and the nobility of motherhood, the actual conditions of medieval life often made unlimited fertility a prescription for disaster. While modern science might dismiss many of these methods as ineffective, recent research has shown that some traditional contraceptive and abortifacient herbs do indeed contain active compounds that affect reproduction. Beneath the surface of official doctrine and public morality lay a vibrant world of human agency, practical knowledge, and mutual support. Medieval sex, forbidden desires, and hidden truths. In the shadowy corners of castle chambers and humble peasant hovels, medieval sexuality unfolded in ways that would shock us today. On one hand, the Catholic Church dominated every aspect of intimate life, declaring that sex was acceptable only within marriage and only for the purpose of creating children. Any pleasure derived from the act was considered sinful, a dangerous indulgence that could lead the soul toward damnation. Peasant marriages were practical arrangements, unions designed to combine resources and ensure the continuation of family lines. Yet even in these humble circumstances, love and desire found expression. Wedding celebrations were raucous affairs where communities gathered to bless the union with fertility rituals that predated Christianity. The wedding ceremony, where guests would escort the bride and groom to their chamber, was both celebration and public acknowledgement of the sexual nature of marriage. In the cramped quarters of peasant huts, privacy was virtually non-existent. Families lived in single rooms shared with livestock, and intimate relations occurred within earshot of children, parents, and animals. This lack of privacy created a matter-of-fact attitude toward sexuality that contrasted sharply with the shame and secrecy promoted by the Church. Children learned about reproduction by observing both human and animal behavior, creating a practical understanding that coexisted with religious teachings about sin and purity. On the other hand, human nature demanded expression, leading to a complex underground world of desire, passion, and forbidden encounters. Physicians trained in the classical traditions of Galen and Hippocrates understood that both men and women contributed to conception. Though their explanations were often wildly inaccurate, they believed that women, like men, produced seed, and that pregnancy resulted from the mixing of hot male seed with cool female seed. This led to the conclusion that female pleasure was necessary for conception, a belief that would seem progressive by later standards. Medical texts describe various positions and techniques for enhancing fertility and, contrary to church teaching, acknowledged that sexual pleasure served important functions beyond mere procreation. The famous physician Avicenna wrote extensively about sexual health, recommending specific foods, exercises, and even mechanical devices to enhance performance and satisfaction. These medical traditions, the Church's control over sexuality was absolute and detailed. Canon law dictated not only who could marry whom, but when and how often married couples could engage in intimate relations. Sex was forbidden during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, during menstruation, pregnancy, and while nursing. By some calculations, the Church had declared sexual relations forbidden for nearly half the year. Even when permitted, The act was to be performed in darkness, in silence, and in the missionary position only. Any deviation was considered a grave sin. While we've explored the brutal realities of clan warfare, the grinding poverty of peasant life, and the iron grip of the Catholic Church, courtly love emerged as a sophisticated form of romantic expression that celebrated the very passions the Church condemned. This tradition, popularized in the courts of southern France, created an elaborate code of conduct around romantic longing and unrequited desire. Knights would dedicate themselves to married noblewomen, composing poetry and songs that praised their beauty while maintaining the fiction that their love remained pure and unconsummated. The reality, of course, was often quite different. Behind the elegant verses and chivalric gestures lay a world where powerful men took what they desired and women had little recourse. The droit du seigneur, or right of the first night, may have been more legend than law, but it reflected the very real power imbalances that defined medieval sexuality. Lords could and did demand sexual favors from servant women, and resistance often meant dismissal, violence, or worse. There's one aspect of medieval existence that remained largely hidden from public view, yet shaped every intimate moment between husband and wife, lord and servant, monk and maiden. Tonight we delve into the most private chambers of medieval society, where desire battled dogma and human nature clashed with divine decree. For in this world of rigid social hierarchies and religious control, sexuality became a battlefield where the most fundamental human drives met the most severe restrictions. Medieval women, through centuries of careful observation and experimentation, had identified substances and techniques that actually worked, even if they couldn't explain the mechanisms in modern scientific terms. She has never been alone with a man, never seen an unclothed male body, and certainly never received any instruction about what was to occur in the marriage bed. The Church had taught her that carnal desire was sinful, that her body was a vessel of temptation, and that her highest calling was purity. Yet here she stood, trembling in a drafty castle chamber, about to become wife to a man she had met only hours before. This was the reality for countless medieval women, thrust into marriages arranged not for love, but for political alliance, land consolidation, or simple survival. The bride's education about sexuality came not from mothers or midwives, but from whispered conversations with other women who themselves had learned through painful experience. The Church's teachings provided little guidance for the actual mechanics of marital relations, focusing instead on the sinfulness of pleasure and the duty of procreation. The legacy of this hidden world extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The knowledge and networks that medieval women created to control their fertility laid the groundwork for later developments in reproductive medicine. The courage they showed in defying official prohibition helped establish the principle that women should have some say in their own reproductive destiny. The solidarity they demonstrated in sharing dangerous knowledge and supporting each other through difficult procedures prefigured later movements for women's rights and reproductive freedom. While medical authorities wrote learned treatises about women's bodies, it was women themselves who possessed the most practical and detailed knowledge of how those bodies actually functioned. The courage required to navigate this world cannot be understated. Women who sought to control their fertility faced not just physical dangers, but the constant threat of discovery and punishment. They risked excommunication, social ostracism, legal prosecution, even execution, if their activities were exposed and condemned as witchcraft. Yet they persisted, driven by necessity and sustained by the bonds of female solidarity that transcended official disapproval. The guilt imposed by religious teachings warred with practical necessity, creating internal conflicts that could last a lifetime. Many women carried the weight of these decisions in silence, never speaking of them even to their closest confidants. For medieval men, this world remained largely invisible and incomprehensible. While they might benefit from women's ability to prevent or end pregnancies, they were typically excluded from the knowledge and networks that made such control possible. This created another layer of gender-based secrecy within medieval sexuality, with women possessing and guarding information that could dramatically affect their lives and relationships. The rare and exotic ingredients required for some procedures created their own networks of trade, with merchants and apothecaries serving as discreet intermediaries. Local magistrates might look the other way when dealing with cases that did involve obvious fraud or harm to others. Some legal codes made distinctions between different types of interventions, reflecting the complex moral calculations that govern medieval life. As we consider this hidden dimension of medieval sexuality, we reminded once again of the remarkable resourcefulness and agency that medieval women exercised despite the constraints placed upon them. In a world that officially denied them control over their own bodies and reproductive choices, they created elaborate systems of knowledge and support that allowed them to exercise such control. They transformed religious and medical texts written by men into practical guides for their own needs. They built networks of trust and mutual aid that operated entirely outside official institutions. These practices also revealed the sophisticated understanding medieval women had of their own bodies and reproductive cycles. They tracked their monthly courses with careful attention, noting patterns and variations that might indicate pregnancy or fertility. They understood the connection between nursing and reduced fertility, often extending breastfeeding as a natural form of birth control. They recognized the signs of pregnancy from its earliest stages and knew how their bodies responded to different herbs and treatments. The psychological dimensions of this hidden world were equally profound. The intersection of this reproductive underground with medieval law created additional complications. While church law clearly condemned these practices, secular authorities often took a more pragmatic approach. This clandestine world of reproductive control also highlights the fundamental tensions between medieval ideals and medieval realities. These practices also reveal the sophisticated understanding of cause and effect that characterized medieval folk medicine. As our exploration of medieval sexuality draws toward a close, this underground world of reproductive control serves as a powerful reminder of the complexity and richness of medieval life. Picture, if you will, a young bride on her wedding night in 14th century Scotland. Medieval sexuality existed in a constant state of contradiction, yet despite these restrictions, medieval people found ways to navigate the complex landscape of desire and duty. For the common people, sexuality was intertwined with survival. Medieval medicine offered a fascinating blend of ancient knowledge and religious superstition when it came to sexuality and reproduction. Physicians trained in the classical traditions of Galen and Hippocrates understood that both men and women contributed to conception. Though their explanations were often wildly inaccurate, they believed that women, like men, produced seed, and that pregnancy resulted from the mixing of hot male seed with cool female seed. Women passed down knowledge of plants like pennyroyal, tansy, and rue that could prevent or terminate pregnancy. Rather than attempting to eliminate the practice entirely, most authorities chose to control and contain it. Knights would swear oaths of eternal devotion to one another. This tradition, which emerged in the courts of Provence and Aquitaine, celebrated passionate, often adulterous love as the highest form of human experience. Courts developed elaborate rituals around romantic attachment, including formal ceremonies where knights would pledge their service to particular ladies, tournaments fought in honor of favored women, and complex systems of symbolic communication through gifts, colors, and secret messages. These practices allowed for the expression of desires that could not be openly acknowledged, while maintaining the fiction of spiritual rather than physical attraction. With so many traditional authority figures dead or displaced, social control weakened. Some monasteries developed strict rules about physical contact and privacy, forbidding monks from being alone together or touching one another unnecessarily. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian teaching, creating complex theories about the proper role of sexuality in human life. These discussions acknowledged that sexual desire was natural and necessary for the continuation of the human race, while maintaining that its expression should be carefully controlled and directed toward appropriate ends. These theological developments had practical implications for how ordinary people understood their own sexuality. The confession process, which became increasingly important during the medieval period, required individuals to examine their sexual thoughts and behaviors in detail. Priests developed elaborate systems for categorizing and assigning penance for various sexual sins, creating a kind of moral accounting that made sexuality a matter of ongoing spiritual concern for every Christian. Others focused on spiritual disciplines designed to sublimate sexual energy into religious devotion. The success of these approaches varied widely, and many religious houses struggled with ongoing problems related to sexual conduct. Female religious communities faced particular challenges related to sexuality and gender. Nuns were often suspected of lesbian relationships, and convents were sometimes seen as hotbeds of sexual deviance. These suspicions reflected broader anxieties about women, sexuality, and the difficulty of imagining that women could live together without male supervision while maintaining proper moral standards. The reality was probably much more mundane, with most nuns struggling to balance their spiritual commitments with the ordinary human needs for companionship and affection. Young people found themselves with greater freedom to choose their own partners, and women whose husbands had died gained unprecedented independence. These changes would have lasting effects on European society long after the immediate crisis of the plague had passed. Religious communities provided some of the most interesting examples of medieval attitudes toward sexuality. Monasteries and convents were supposed to be havens of chastity, where men and women dedicated their lives to spiritual rather than physical love. The reality, however, was often quite different. The records of ecclesiastical courts are filled with cases of sexual misconduct among the clergy, ranging from simple lapses in celibacy to complex romantic entanglements that lasted for years. The tension between courtly love ideals and Christian morality created ongoing debates about the nature of proper relationships between men and women. Some religious authorities denounced courtly love as a dangerous heresy that elevated human passion above divine love. Others attempted to reconcile the tradition with Christian teaching by emphasizing the spiritual rather than physical aspects of romantic devotion. This ongoing negotiation between secular and religious approaches to love and sexuality would continue throughout the medieval period and beyond. The key elements of courtly love included the worship of an unattainable lady, the ennobling power of desire, and the celebration of suffering in the name of love. The massive population loss created labor shortages that gave surviving workers greater economic power and social mobility. For women, this meant expanded opportunities for independent work and delayed marriage. The traditional patterns of arranged marriage and early childbearing were disrupted as families struggled to adapt to new economic realities. The psychological impact of the plague years also influenced attitudes toward sexuality and pleasure. Faced with the constant possibility of death, many people adopted a more immediate approach to gratification. The traditional Christian emphasis on preparing for the afterlife seemed less compelling, when death might arrive at any moment. This led to what some contemporary observers described as a moral loosening. With increased sexual activity outside marriage and greater acceptance of previously forbidden pleasures, the poetry and literature of courtly love created elaborate fantasies of romantic devotion that stood in stark contrast to the arranged marriages and practical partnerships that dominated medieval society. These works described knights who would endure any hardship for a glimpse of their beloved's favor, ladies whose beauty and virtue inspired great deeds, and the exquisite torture of loving someone beyond reach. While these literary creations may seem artificial to modern readers, they reflected genuine longings for emotional and spiritual connection that the practical realities of medieval life often denied. Monks would write passionate letters expressing their spiritual love, and young men would share beds as a matter of course in crowded households. The line between spiritual and physical intimacy was often deliberately blurred, allowing for relationships that satisfied emotional and perhaps physical needs while maintaining plausible deniability about their true nature. Women's same-sex relationships were less documented, but certainly existed. The relative invisibility of female homosexuality in medieval records reflects both the patriarchal nature of society, which paid less attention to women's private lives, and perhaps different social attitudes toward female intimacy. Women were expected to be more emotionally expressive and physically affectionate with one another, creating space for relationships that might have attracted suspicion if they had occurred between men. Prostitutes were required to live in designated areas, wear distinctive clothing, and submit to regular health inspections. They were forbidden from working on holy days, and were often required to attend church services designed specifically for their moral instruction. This approach reflected a pragmatic recognition that male sexual desires would find expression regardless of religious prohibition. Homosexuality in medieval society existed in a complex legal and social framework that varied significantly across time and place. The Church condemned same-sex relations as gravely sinful, classifying them among the worst forms of sexual deviance. Legal penalties could be severe, including death by burning in some jurisdictions. However, the reality was often more nuanced. Close relationships between men, particularly in military and religious contexts, were common and often celebrated as long as they maintained the appearance of spiritual rather than physical bonds. Barrier methods using animal bladders or cloth were known, though their effectiveness was limited. The withdrawal method was probably the most common form of birth control, despite church teachings that even this interrupted the natural purpose of sexual relations. Prostitution flourished in medieval society, despite or perhaps because of the church's strict teachings about sexuality. Every major city had its red light districts where sex workers plied their trade under various forms of legal regulation. These women occupied a complex social position, simultaneously necessary for the functioning of urban society and condemned as moral outcasts. They served not only visiting merchants and traveling soldiers, but also the many men who remained unmarried due to economic constraints or religious vows. This led to the conclusion that female pleasure was necessary for conception, a belief that would seem progressive by later standards. Medical texts described various positions and techniques for enhancing fertility and, contrary to church teaching, acknowledged that sexual pleasure served important functions beyond mere procreation. The famous physician Avicenna wrote extensively about sexual health, recommending specific foods, exercises, and even mechanical devices to enhance performance and satisfaction. These medical traditions, largely preserved and transmitted through Islamic scholarship, offered a counterpoint to Christian teachings about the sinfulness of carnal pleasure. Women in medieval society faced particular challenges when it came to sexuality. They were simultaneously revered as the mothers of future generations and reviled as the descendants of Eve, the temptress who brought sin into the world. This contradiction shaped every aspect of female sexual experience. Young women were taught to guard their virginity as their most precious possession, for upon it depended their marriage prospects and family honor. Yet once married, they were expected to submit to their husband's desires regardless of their own feelings or physical condition. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was both surprisingly sophisticated and utterly wrong. Physicians knew about the clitoris, which they called the female member, and understood its role in sexual pleasure. However, they also believed in bizarre theories about the wandering womb, a condition supposedly caused by lack of sexual activity that could cause various ailments as the uterus literally moved around the body in search of satisfaction. This led to treatments that seem absurd today, but reflected genuine attempts to understand female sexuality within the limited scientific framework of the time. Contraception, while officially forbidden by the church, was widely practiced through a combination of herbal remedies, mechanical devices, and behavioral techniques. The regulation of prostitution reveals much about medieval attitudes towards sexuality. The medieval period saw the emergence of romantic friendships between men that pushed the boundaries of acceptable intimacy. The rise of courtly love in the 12th and 13th centuries represented a revolutionary approach to sexuality and romance that would influence Western culture for centuries to come. The influence of courtly love extended beyond literature into actual social practices. The Black Death of the 14th century had profound effects on medieval sexuality and social relationships. The disruption of normal social patterns during plague years created opportunities for sexual relationships that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The challenge of maintaining celibacy in religious communities led to various strategies for managing sexual desire. The medieval period also saw the development of sophisticated theological discussions about the nature of sexual desire and its relationship to spiritual life. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian teaching, creating complex theories about the proper role of sexuality in human life. These discussions acknowledged that sexual desire was natural and necessary for the continuation of the human race, while maintaining that its expression should be carefully controlled and directed toward appropriate ends. These theological developments had practical implications for how ordinary people understood their own sexuality. What differed were the social structures and belief systems that shaped how those desires could be expressed. In their struggles to navigate the competing demands of church, family, and personal longing, they created a rich and complex sexual culture that deserves our understanding rather than our judgment. Their stories remind us that human sexuality has always been political, personal, and profoundly important to how we understand ourselves and our relationships with others. Adulterium, extramarital affairs, stupum, the violation of virgins or widows; stestis, relations between those related by blood or marriage; sodomia, any sexual act that could not result in procreation. The phenomenon of courtly love, with its elaborate codes of romantic passion and idealized devotion, can be seen as one such rebellion. The foblios, those ribald, often bawdy tales that circulated among the common folk, reveal a very different attitude towards sex and pleasure. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Mechthild of Magdeburg, and Julian of Norwich wrote of their spiritual experiences in language that was unmistakably erotic. Physicians like Avicenna and Albertus Magnus wrote extensively about sexual health, arguing that regular sexual activity was necessary for both physical and mental well-being. Gothic cathedrals, those supreme expressions of medieval spirituality, are filled with erotic imagery. From the sensuous curves of the Virgin Mary to the explicitly sexual carvings hidden in dark corners, the Song of Songs, perhaps the most erotically charged book in the Bible, was they described the symptoms of sexual frustration, particularly in women, with clinical precision, and prescribed various remedies, including in extreme cases, manual stimulation by midwives. These medical perspectives often conflicted directly with church teaching, creating yet another source of confusion for medieval people. Was sexual desire a sinful impulse to be suppressed, or a natural bodily function that required regular expression for health? The answer often depended on whom you asked and in what context. They described their union with Christ in terms of physical ecstasy, of burning desire, of intimate caresses and passionate embraces. Were these merely metaphors, attempts to describe the indescribable experience of divine union? Or did they represent a recognition that the spiritual and the sexual were inextricably linked, that the path to God might lead through, rather than around, human sexuality? The Church was never quite comfortable with such expressions, yet it could hardly condemn experiences that so clearly bore the fruits of holiness in the lives of these remarkable women. In these stories, sexual appetite is celebrated rather than condemned. Cleverness in securing sexual satisfaction is applauded, and the pompous moralizing of church authorities is mocked with gleeful irreverence. Consider the tale of the miller's daughter, in which a clever young woman outwits both her father and a lecherous priest to secure a night of passion with her beloved. Or the wife of Bath's tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which argues that women desire sovereignty over their husbands above all else, including control over their own sexual pleasure. These stories suggest that beneath the surface of medieval Christian morality lay a rich vein of sexual pragmatism and even celebration. By placing the beloved on a pedestal, by celebrating the agony of unfulfilled desire, by transforming lust into a quasi-religious experience, the troubadours and their audiences found a way to honor sexuality while ostensibly denying it. The stories that emerge from this tradition reveal the psychological complexity of medieval sexual attitudes. Take the tale of Tristan and Isolde, perhaps the most famous medieval romance. Here we have two lovers whose passion is both celebrated and condemned, whose union is impossible, yet inevitable, whose very suffering becomes a form of spiritual transcendence. The story suggests that perhaps the highest form of love is one that can never be consummated, that the truest devotion lies in perpetual yearning rather than physical fulfillment. Sacrilegium, the seduction of those in religious orders. But the categories grew ever more Byzantine. The Church distinguished between natural and unnatural sins, between sins of commission and omission, between carnal knowledge and mere lustful thoughts. They debated whether it was worse to commit adultery with a married woman or an unmarried one, whether certain sexual positions were inherently sinful, whether pleasure during marital intercourse was acceptable or deplorable. Thomas Aquinas, that towering intellect of medieval theology, attempted to bring order to this chaos through reason and philosophy. In his Summa Theologica, he argued that sexual pleasure was not inherently evil. After all, God had created the human body with its capacity for such sensations. The sin lay not in the pleasure itself, but in seeking pleasure as an end rather than as a means to the divinely ordained purpose of procreation. In the flickering candlelight of medieval chambers, behind the stone walls of castles, for how could one separate the pleasure from the purpose in the heat of passion? How could one ensure that every coupling was motivated purely by the desire for children, and not by the intoxicating pull of physical attraction. The very attempt to analyze one's motivations in such moments seemed to border on the absurd. The confessional became the theater where these intimate dramas played out. Penitents knelt in darkened booths, whispering their sexual transgressions to priests who had supposedly renounced all carnal knowledge. The manuals written for confessors reveal the extraordinary detail with which the Church sought to regulate the sexual lives of its flock. Priests were instructed to ask whether the penitent had sinned with their spouse on holy days, whether they had engaged in foreplay, whether they had assumed forbidden positions, whether they had used herbs or practices to prevent conception. The psychological toll of this constant scrutiny cannot be overstated. Medieval people lived in a state of perpetual sexual anxiety, never quite certain whether their most intimate moments pleased God or condemned their souls to hellfire. The very pleasure that should have bonded couples together became a source of shame and self-doubt. Lovemaking was transformed from an expression of joy and connection into a careful calculation of sin and salvation. And the wattle and daub partitions of peasant huts, men and women found ways to express the desires that made them human. Their legacy lives on in our own ongoing struggles to balance passion with responsibility, individual desire with social obligation, and the search for love with the practical necessities of life. The confession process, which became increasingly important during the medieval period, required individuals to examine their sexual thoughts and behaviors in detail. As we near the end of our exploration into medieval sexuality, we must confront one of the most fascinating contradictions of this era: the eternal struggle between earthly desire and spiritual salvation. St. Augustine had declared that without the fall, procreation would have occurred through pure will, without the messy complications of lust or pleasure. Every surge of passion, every quickened heartbeat in a lover's presence, was a reminder of humanity's fallen state. Yet paradoxically, this same church that condemned desire also sanctified marriage, declaring it a sacred sacrament that transformed the very sin of lust into holy procreation. This contradiction created a psychological labyrinth from which few medieval souls could escape unscathed. Consider the wedding night of our blacksmith and merchant's daughter. After months of enforced separation, after countless nights of fevered dreams and guilty self-recrimination, they finally come together in lawful union. But even in this moment of sanctified consummation, the specter of sin haunts their bed. Have they coupled purely for God's glory and the continuation of the human race? Or have they succumbed to base animal instincts that mark them as little better than beasts? The Church offered no easy answers to these tormented questions. Instead, it provided an elaborate taxonomy of sexual sin that would make even the most dedicated scholars' heads spin. For medieval people, this wasn't merely an abstract theological debate, but a daily, visceral reality that shaped every intimate encounter, every stolen glance, and every moment of physical longing. Picture, if you will, a young couple in 14th century England. Thomas, a blacksmith's apprentice, and Agnes, a merchant's daughter, have exchanged promises of marriage. Yet the Church demands they wait months for the banns to be read, for the proper dowry negotiations to conclude, for the harvest season to end. But their bodies burn with desire that recognizes no ecclesiastical calendar. What torment this must have been, to love deeply, to yearn desperately, yet to face eternal damnation for acting upon the most natural of human impulses. Priests developed elaborate systems for categorizing and assigning penance for various sexual sins, creating a kind of moral accounting that made sexuality a matter of ongoing spiritual concern for every Christian. The influence of Islamic and Jewish traditions on medieval Christian sexuality is often overlooked, but was significant in many regions. In Spain, southern Italy, and other areas where different religious communities coexisted, ideas about sexuality and marriage practices crossed cultural boundaries. Islamic medicine, with its more positive attitude towards sexual pleasure, influenced Christian physicians. Jewish marriage customs, which celebrated sexuality within marriage, provided alternative models for Christian couples. These cross-cultural exchanges enriched the sexual culture of medieval Europe, while creating additional tensions with official church teaching. As we reach the end of our journey through the intimate chambers of medieval society, we see a world where sexuality was simultaneously celebrated and condemned, carefully regulated, and wildly transgressed. The medieval period established patterns of thinking about sex, love, and relationships that would influence Western culture for centuries to come. The tension between spiritual and physical love, the celebration of romantic suffering, the anxiety about female sexuality, and the attempt to reconcile human desire with divine will all emerged from this complex and contradictory historical moment. The men and women of medieval times were not so different from us in their fundamental desires for love, pleasure, and connection. The paradox of pleasure and piety. The Church taught that sexual desire itself was the poisoned fruit of original sin. There was fornicatio, sex between unmarried partners. Yet even this nuanced position offered little comfort to the medieval soul wrestling with desire. Yet human nature, as always, found ways to subvert and circumvent these oppressive structures. But not all medieval people were content with such sublimated expressions of sexuality. The mystics of the medieval period offer perhaps the most fascinating example of the era's complex relationship with sexuality and spirituality. The medical texts of the period add another layer to our understanding of medieval sexual attitudes. The art and literature of the period reflect this fundamental ambivalence about sexuality. Gothic cathedrals, those supreme expressions of medieval spirituality, are filled with erotic imagery. From the sensuous curves of the Virgin Mary to the explicitly sexual carvings, hidden in dark corners, the Song of Songs, their sexual choices were not merely personal preferences or even social contracts. They would have sought to balance their love for each other with their fear of God, or desire for pleasure with their hope for salvation. While the Catholic Church dominated moral discourse with its rigid prohibitions, actual sexual practices were far more complex and nuanced than religious authorities would have preferred. Archaeological evidence and court records reveal a thriving underground world of sexual expression that existed alongside official morality. Couples often lived together and began sexual relationships before formal church ceremonies, a practice the clergy railed against but could never fully suppress. The medieval concept of marriage by consent meant that private vows exchanged between lovers could be considered valid even without priestly blessing. Prostitution flourished in medieval towns and cities, often operating with tacit official approval. Bathhouses served as thinly veiled brothels, while red light districts provided regulated spaces for commercial sex. The Church's ambivalent attitude toward prostitution, condemning it morally while recognizing its social function, created a complex web of regulation and tolerance that varied from place to place. Perhaps most tellingly, the very vehemence of religious condemnation suggests how widespread these forbidden practices actually were. The constant need for clergy to preach against sexual sins, the detailed penalties outlined in penitential manuals, and the frequency of ecclesiastical court cases dealing with adultery and fornication, all point to a society where official morality and actual behavior existed in constant tension. This dynamic between repression and expression, between spiritual ideals and human desires, created a sexual culture that was simultaneously constrained and creative. Medieval people found ways to pursue intimacy, pleasure, and reproductive choice within the narrow confines permitted by their society, demonstrating the persistent human capacity to adapt and survive even under the most restrictive circumstances. The legacy of these medieval tensions continues to influence Western attitudes toward sexuality today, reminding us that the relationship between official morality and private behavior has always been complex, contested, and ultimately very human. Contraceptive knowledge passed down through generations of women included herbal remedies like silphirum and Queen Anne's lace, pessaries made from honey and crocodile dung, and various barrier methods, while the Church officially condemned all forms of birth control. Practical necessity often trumped religious doctrine for families struggling to survive. Marriage customs varied dramatically between social classes and regions. Among the nobility, unions were primarily political and economic arrangements, with little consideration for personal attraction or compatibility. Young women, sometimes barely into their teens, were married off to cement alliances or secure inheritances. The concept of romantic love, while celebrated in courtly literature, was largely separate from the institution of marriage itself. The Church's sexual teachings were uncompromising in their severity. Sexual activity was permissible only within marriage and solely for procreation. Pleasure itself was viewed with deep suspicion, if not outright condemnation. Married couples were expected to abstain during Lent, Advent, feast days, Sundays, Fridays, and various other holy periods, leaving precious few days when intimacy was officially sanctioned. Women were considered particularly dangerous, their sexuality seen as a corrupting force that could lead men astray from spiritual pursuits. In doing so, they participated in one of the most fundamentally human struggles, the attempt to reconcile our animal nature with our spiritual aspirations, our earthly desires with our heavenly longings. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson we can draw from medieval sexuality, that the tension between flesh and spirit, between pleasure and piety, is not a problem to be solved, but a paradox to be lived. The medieval period, for all its contradictions and complexities, reminds us that human sexuality is never merely biological or social. It is always inevitably touched by the sacred and the profound. As we close this chapter of our journey through medieval intimacy, we carry with us the recognition that our ancestors, despite living in a world so different from our own, grappled with questions that remain achingly relevant today. How do we honor both our physical and spiritual natures? How do we balance desire with responsibility, pleasure with purpose, love with law? They were decisions that would determine their fate in the afterlife. The weight of such responsibility must have been crushing at times. It had also imbued even the most mundane physical encounters with cosmic significance. The medieval period left us with a complex and contradictory legacy regarding human sexuality. On one hand, it established patterns of sexual shame and repression that would influence Western culture for centuries to come. On the other hand, it produced some of the most profound meditations on the relationship between physical and spiritual love in human history. Perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that human sexuality cannot be contained or controlled by even the most powerful institutions. Despite centuries of church teaching, despite elaborate systems of confession and penance, despite threats of eternal damnation, medieval people continued to love, to desire, and to seek pleasure in ways that were authentically human, rather than artificially pious. Perhaps the most erotically charged book in the Bible was endlessly commented upon by medieval theologians, who struggled to reconcile its celebration of physical love with Christian doctrine. Even the lives of the saints revealed this tension. Saint Mary of Egypt was a prostitute who found God in the desert. Saint Mary Magdalene was traditionally identified as a reformed adulteress. The message seemed to be that sexual experience, even sexual sin, was not incompatible with ultimate salvation. Indeed, it might even be a necessary prelude to it. As we consider the sexual lives of ordinary medieval people, we must remember that they inhabited a world where every aspect of life was seen through the lens of eternity. The blacksmith Thomas and the merchant's daughter Agnes, with whom we began this exploration, would have navigated these treacherous waters as best they could. Looking at medieval sexuality through the lens of lived human experience reveals a fascinating paradox between official doctrine and private reality. Yet, despite these harsh restrictions, human nature inevitably asserted itself. For peasants and artisans, marriages were typically more egalitarian partnerships born of practical necessity. Couples often lived together and began sexual relationships before formal church ceremonies, a practice the clergy railed against but could never fully suppress. The medieval concept of marriage by consent meant that private vows exchanged between lovers could be considered valid even without priestly blessing. Prostitution flourished in medieval towns and cities, often operating with tacit official approval. Bathhouses served as thinly veiled brothels, while red light districts provided regulated spaces for commercial sex. The Church's ambivalent attitude toward prostitution, condemning it morally, while recognizing its social function, created a complex web of regulation and tolerance that varied from place to place. Perhaps most tellingly, the very vehemence of religious condemnation suggests how widespread these forbidden practices actually were. The constant need for clergy to preach against sexual sins, the detailed penalties outlined in penitential manuals, and the frequency of ecclesiastical court cases dealing with adultery and fornication all point to a society where official morality and actual behavior existed in constant tension. This dynamic between repression and expression, between spiritual ideals and human desires, created a sexual culture that was simultaneously constrained and creative. Medieval people found ways to pursue intimacy, pleasure, and reproductive choice within the narrow confines permitted by their society, demonstrating the persistent human capacity to adapt and survive even under the most restrictive circumstances. The legacy of these medieval tensions continues to influence Western attitudes towards sexuality today, reminding us that the relationship between official morality and private behavior has always been complex, contested, and ultimately very human.